When I first planned out my initial desk setup way back in the summer of 2023, I knew that I wanted to go with a dual screen setup in order to maximize productivity. And after bouncing around between a couple of different ideas, I landed on this layout, with the secondary display mounted vertically, and the whole thing being slightly offset so that it utilized the limited space on my desk in the best way possible. And honestly, I absolutely loved it. At the time, one of the main things I wanted to use this setup for was game development, which involves a lot of coding, and the vertical display really felt like a great fit for me when it came to that. But things change. Over time, I started to focus less on game development and more on making YouTube videos about tech and desk setup related stuff, simply because I found it to be so interesting. And this meant that while I was using my main monitor to either write scripts or edit videos, the secondary monitor would be where I had my internet browser open, either for watching stuff on YouTube or for doing research. And since the monitor was stacked vertically, it meant that, in essence, I was only using the top like 1/3 of the screen, which was basically the equivalent of using a 15-inch monitor rather than a 27-inch monitor. And as we all know, size matters. Unfortunately. Anyway, it was time for an upgrade, but I didn't want to just go with a plain old side-by-side monitor setup like the one I have at my office job. That shit is for boring corporate Alex. No, nerdy YouTube Alex who likes to talk about tech deserves something a little more special. So, as you can see, I went ahead and pulled the trigger on a rather contentious layout. As far as I can tell, a stacked screen setup like this isn't all that common or widespread amongst the tech community here on YouTube, and it seems like most people who do end up adopting one at some point inevitably move away from it again not too much later. So in this video, I wanted to go over some of the pros and cons of having a layout like this, the different use cases I think it's most suited for, as well as what things you'd need to consider before implementing something like this in your own setup. But before we get into all of that, let me first take a moment to show you what I'm working with.
Please, don't.
My main display is the Asus TUF Gaming VG27AQ, which is a 27-inch 1440p IPS display with a refresh rate of 165 Hz. It's not exactly the best monitor on the market right now, and given that I can't seem to find a single video on YouTube that doesn't include a 32-inch OLED monitor with a refresh rate of 500 million Hz, the temptation to replace this thing has been quite overwhelming as of late. But for now, it does the job pretty well, although it really isn't the best when it comes to color accuracy. Lucky for me though, that also gives me an excuse to not have to learn anything about color grading, so I guess it works out in the end. On top of that, I have the HP Elite Display E273Q, which is also a 27-inch 1440p IPS display, although this one only goes up to 60 Hz. It is a rather old monitor at this point, but it works well enough for what I use it for. It has an almost Giga Chad-like chin though, so I chose to mount it upside down to avoid having to look at this monstrosity all day and leave me with feelings of inadequacy. Sitting on top of the upper display, I have this light bar from Xiaomi, the Mi Computer Monitor Light Bar, which is a reasonably priced alternative to something like those BenQ monitor light bars that you might have seen being traded for functioning organs in your local alleyway. Honestly, this thing has worked pretty much flawlessly, and I love that it comes with this simple little battery-powered puck that you can use to change the brightness and color temperature of it. But this led me to my first concern, which was whether placing a light bar that high up would still give me the proper results. I was worried that the light would be too faded or widespread at that height, or that it might throw up reflections on the screen since I have the monitors slightly angled out from each other. But luckily, it turns out that it works just fine up here, and it really hasn't changed the lighting on my desk at all. Finally, to mount the two monitors in this configuration, I went with this simple, tall, dual monitor mount, which is from a brand called Neo Mounts. Now, one thing to note here is that this type of mount is severely limited when it comes to how you want to actually position your monitors. Since it just consists of a single straight bar, the most you can really do is change the height, tilt, and rotation of each display. But since you don't have any control over the depth of that positioning, that means that if you do decide to tilt your upper monitor, which is a fairly common thing to do, you'll either be left with a bit of a gap in between your monitors if your main display is kept straight, or you could do what I did, which is to tilt out your lower monitor to the same angle so that your displays line up perfectly. And honestly, this works out pretty well for me since my desk is fairly wide on both sides. But if you have a more narrow desk, this could mean that you end up sitting just a bit too close to the screen. So just keep that in mind if you do decide to go for something like this. Alright, so now that you've seen how I've set it all up, the big question that needs answering here is, what is it actually like to live with this setup? And I'll start with the first positive thing I noticed, which was also my primary motivation for changing to this setup to begin with. You get way more usable screen real estate with a setup like this than what you do with a vertical monitor, at least in most use cases. In fact, I'd say that unless you do a lot of coding or you like to be able to see the entirety of documents on one screen more clearly, then I'd be hard-pressed to find a situation where having a vertical monitor beats the sheer usability of having two horizontal monitors. But Alex, you stunningly handsome Adonis of a man, I hear you saying, you can get the same results without stacking your monitors. So what's actually better about this setup? Well, for starters, it's a lot more ergonomic in some ways, since you won't have to constantly look off to your side whenever you're using the second screen. And yes, obviously you will have to look up instead, but we'll get to that point later. More importantly, on that note, it also just feels like a way more seamless experience. I don't know, it's a little bit hard to quantify this point precisely, but there's a bit more of a sense of cohesion between your two monitors when you have them stacked like this. Maybe it's due to the simple fact that both of them are entirely centered in your field of view at all times, regardless of which screen you're actually focusing on, but it really does feel like two connected halves of a whole in a way that two monitors next to each other doesn't quite match. But then a bigger point, and a way more obvious one, is that stacking your monitors takes up a lot less space on your desk. As I mentioned before, I have a fairly big desk measuring in at 160 centimeters by 80 centimeters, or 63 by 31.5 inches for all my gringos out there. But even with my secondary display mounted vertically, these things took up a lot of real estate on my desk. Now, to be fair, I also have these giant speakers, but even without them, it would have felt a little cramped at times. But now, I mean, to say that this space feels way more open would be a massive understatement, honestly. Regaining the space that my second monitor was taking up has felt like a complete game changer, as I was able to move all my accessories and decorations all the way to the back end of the desk, giving me a lot more freedom to choose how I want this place to look, as well as making it way less easily cluttered. Oh, and have I mentioned that I also think it just looks a lot better? I know some people think stacking your monitors like this is a little overkill, but I mean, I'm also the type of guy who loves tech so much that I started a whole YouTube channel to talk about it, so perhaps I just fit neatly into the target audience for nerds who think this kind of thing looks cool. But to be fair, it's not just me. The other day I came home from work to find my 5-year-old daughter sitting in here typing away at the keyboard because she thinks this setup makes her look like a hacker. So clearly I'm onto something here. So to summarize the positive points, you get more usable screen real estate, you spend less time looking off to the side, it's a more seamless experience, you clear up a lot of space on your desk, and it looks cool. So, what are some of the downsides of using a setup like this? Well, there's the obvious one that I know you've all been thinking since the moment you saw the thumbnail for this video. In the words of the immortal monks of Shaolin, having a monitor sitting way above your eye line means that you'll be looking up anytime you're using that display. And since we tend to aim our heads in the direction we're actually looking, that means that unless you're Batman, you'll be craning your head upwards a lot, which isn't exactly great for your neck. And I'll be honest, this is definitely something that you have to be conscious about. I haven't had any real neck pain in the past few weeks since setting up this thing, but I do also take some precautions in order to keep that from happening. First of all, when I'm watching any type of content on the top screen, I make sure to lean back in my chair, which has a headrest. And this last point is something that I think is pretty vital here. Without the headrest, I'm not sure I would have been able to escape having any neck pain, as I would have had to just angle my neck upwards without any real support, which isn't the most natural position to be sitting in. But then that leads me to the second precaution I take, which is to be mindful of how I'm actually sitting. I tend to hunch forward a little bit when I'm working or gaming, and because of that, I do all my writing, gaming, and editing on the lower display. Because if I were to hunch forward and then rotate my head upwards at the same time, I'd be putting a lot of strain on my neck, which would definitely lead to fatigue or pain over time. And look, I'm making it sound like I have to jump through hoops every day in order to protect myself just to be able to have a setup like this, but honestly, it's not that big a deal. It's not something I worry about or something that takes a massive toll on my mental energy. It's just something that I keep in the back of my mind, no pun intended, to make sure I'm not at risk of injuring myself. It's no different than reminding yourself to have proper seating posture or standing up every now and then to alleviate potential back pain. So just keep these things in mind and you'll be fine. Other than that, one minor issue with the way I've set up my monitors is that the bottom screen has become a bit of a dust magnet since I've angled it out slightly. But this just means I have to wipe it down with a cloth once every week or so. All in all, the negative points with a setup like this are the potential for neck pain if you're not careful, as well as having to do a bit more dusting off every now and then. Overall, I'm extremely happy with this setup, and I think I'll be sticking with it for a long time. I know that there's always a bit of a honeymoon period whenever you alter your setup, where the novelty of the change is enough to make you happy, but it really does feel like a substantial upgrade compared to the layout I had before, and I do get a lot more joy out of using my secondary display in this configuration. So, to summarize, a stacked monitor layout gives you a more seamless experience while being more usable. It fits well in smaller spaces and clears up a lot of real estate on your desk, but you want to be mindful of how you're sitting when you're using that top display. So, if you have a dual monitor setup, a chair with a headrest, and you're looking to clear up some space on your desk, I'd say it's definitely worth giving a go. That's it for this video. Please do consider giving it a like, leave a comment down below letting me know what kind of setup you're rocking, and subscribe to my channel for more tech-related content. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.